The reading of the widow is an interesting reading. The traditional explanation of what's happening in this reading is that the widow putting in that amount of money is a story of faith and trust of that widow and generosity. And usually that's the interpretation. It's certainly what's picked up in Mark's gospel of an example of faith. But last year in some of the resources for this, or last time in the lectionary for this reading, there is an alternative interpretation that has become something that some people find an interesting way to think about this reading, which brings out something different to the normal explanation of the traditional reading of the meaning of this passage. And it's not to say that any one of these readings is the only interpretation, because an interpretation is always, it's always what we get out of it and what God says to us in the reading, isn't it? It's not just about what I think the interpretation is, and that's the only one. God speaks to us as we read the text. And one of the things that people have wondered about is whether the woman is, what's the woman's relationship to the temple? And it's picked up in the story. And it's picking up this passage of Jesus talking here and using this example and speaking to the scribes, and this story of the widow that Mark uses follows on from the stories of Jesus, of the scribes and Pharisees and elders trying to trick Jesus and find a way of silencing him, and not having much success. So it's in this passages where Mark is showing us the opposition to Jesus that we have this story of the widow and this alternative interpretation. Because one of the things that Jesus is saying about the scribes is that there were people in that religious system who were not treating the widows well, and they were taking their land and their houses and putting them under, taking their possessions and not treating them well. Story of a system that was not working the way it was originally intended. So the question is, if the widow was actually someone whose house had been devoured by a broken system, because it shouldn't have been happening that way, it puts a different interpretation on the reading. Because she's relating to a system that maybe she knows is unjust, a system that has taken her house away, and one that is not the way that God would intend. So if that was her relationship to the temple, what difference does that make in our understanding of this reading and of the gift, the generous gift that she gave? So the question is, if she's putting in the last of her money and her house is gone, is this actually a sign of faith that she's even willing to give her last money and trust in God? Or is this an example of she's reached the point where she feels that little hope and is giving the last because she's really not sure what the future is for herself? It's also potentially a commentary on the system that allowed the people of faith to be not care for the poor, and the potential of a corrupt system in the way that the way it was operating. Systems can become corrupt. People in power can lose sight of the people they're there to serve. Now, there's an example in the news this week, which was interesting, of Tim Smith. Now, I'm not making a political comment of anything about Tim, but it was interesting. An article that I was reading, and Judy's going to put that up now, of putting alongside of Tim Smith's comment that what he did really, one mistake didn't need to be mean that he needed to end his political career. And the comments that you'll see on the other side, which is probably too small for you to read, but they're comments of what he said to other people about how the mistakes that they had made, that they should be removed from office or whatever consequences they should experience because of what they had done. And it's interesting, they're pointing out that while Tim was using one measure for people that he was saying had done the wrong thing, he wasn't using that same measure for himself. And it reminded me, as I was reading this reading, it just reminded me of the way that any system can get a particular understanding of what's happening and a way of looking at things in the world. But then when it comes to looking at ourselves and recognizing, critiquing our own behavior, we can actually gloss over things in a different way than what we might when we look at other people. And in a sense, is this what's also being picked up in the reading about the widow and her giving? Bill Loader makes the interesting point in his commentary on this passage. He says that human nature has a way of corrupting the most sacred and turning it to the ends of greed and self-aggrandizement. If we're not aware of our need for praise and the sense in which we might feel that we feel inferior in some way and we need to bolster ourselves and make ourselves look better than what we are, or hide any of our weaknesses, this can lead us to behaviours that can infect a system and corrupt a system in a way that is not helpful for people. And Bill then makes the comment that people acting out of their inadequacy and seeking power and seeking to impress, it's little surprise that abuse becomes embedded within the system is always the danger. And we need to be aware of that in all of our systems and in our behaviour and the way we relate. So this is a different way of understanding the passage. The passage maybe is not just a critique of the woman's generosity, but also follows on from the critique and the criticism that Jesus makes of the scribes before the story of the widow, and reminds us we all need to be careful and aware of what's really important and what are the things that we are seeking. What are the passions that consume us, the things that we are exploring? If we don't have an awareness of our needs, then we can be consumed by power, by social media, beauty and money. And we see this in the news. In the past week, we've seen this in the news. And these can lead to people being devalued because the important thing becomes what I think and my well-being rather than thinking about everyone. Whereas Jesus comes bringing generosity, bringing love, and preaching about God's concern for the poor, for the widow and those in need, and not using our power over them, but actually to empower them in the situation in which they're in. We sang about the deer panting for water. We really need to be aware of what our desires are. And in seeking God, we seek the welfare of others because that's what love is about. That's what God is about, and the welfare of all. This week, as we come up towards Remembrance Day on Thursday, it's a reminder for us to just be aware of the ways that whole nations can treat other groups of people as being unworthy and the consequences of that. We see that in our world today with a number of different groups. and the way that some nations are treating them. We can see it in situations within government where people are not always treated as justice is not always well served, a sense of justice for all in a whole lot of ways. But it's a reminder for us of the injustices we see and even our attitudes to people. Whichever way we interpret this story of the widow, whether it's an example for us of generosity and giving in spite of the injustice that we see, or whether it's just an example of generosity, it's a story where God can speak to us in so many ways. And particularly in the words of the theme slide there, the road of life takes many tricky turns. We don't know what's round the corner. And I was thinking, blowing the horn on the train, when we get to spots where things get tricky, sometimes God gives us a warning. And we need to be aware of those warnings of when we might be overstepping the mark, the bounds of what God would want. Or we need to be aware of other people and where God's at work with them. Going in the train, it was really good to have the two drivers there driving the train and knowing what they were doing. Looking at, in Phil's sense, he was standing behind me, looking over my shoulder, making sure that everything was right on our side and the view from our side of the train. Bob was on the other side. We need to remember that God's looking over our shoulder. We need to remember the Bobs in our congregation that are also looking out for the church, for God's kingdom, but also for us. And be aware of the community of faith and the importance of the way that we relate and we care for each other, and the way that we support each other in the road of life and the tricky turns, so that we may be aware of all God's resources that we have and we bring as a community and that God lends to us. As God builds our community, may we be strengthened, may we make everyone welcome and care for everyone, and may all that we do show that all are welcome to this church, to God's church.